September 2000, Calgary, Alberta, Canada, is an odd place to start a mystery that would occur in Nevada, but that's exactly where we find 28-year-old truck driver Trevor Angell. Trevor was a Canadian citizen whose primary route saw him making deliveries to different parts of the western United States and bringing goods back to Canada. But Trevor, who had been driving for a few years by this point, was beginning to get tired of life on the road, which was in no part motivated by the fact that he now had a small child at home along with his wife, both whom he desired to spend more time with. He would contemplate for a while about his future employment and would inform his wife and family that after this last trip to Los Angeles, where he was to deliver a load of meat and then return with bananas from the US, he was calling it quits. This was going to be his last ride. With that set, on September 20th, he jumped in his truck and headed off. The next day, he would arrive in Los Angeles after 25 hours of driving and would then offload the goods and get the return shipment to take back to Calgary. But on his way back, though, he would come up on a small Nevada border town called Primm, a place he was familiar with and stopped every time he came through, because Trevor liked to visit the casino and hotel there. And it wasn't just him. This was a place where a lot of truckers would stop and drink, gamble, or just rest. It's the following day, though, that took an interesting turn, because Trevor would call back home to his wife and tell her some alarming news. He would say he hadn't slept in 4 days. This, of course, led his wife to encourage him to try and lay down and get some rest. Now, whether he did or not is unknown, but it would be later that same day that Trevor's parents got a concerning phone call as well. This time, it was from representatives of the trucking company that Trevor worked for, and they wanted to know why Trevor wasn't answering his phone, and if he was okay, because their company GPS indicated he was still parked in Primm. Was Trevor still asleep, or just gambling it up and didn't care because this was his last ride? No one knew for sure, but 3 days later, when Trevor had still not came home or contacted his family, everyone got worried, and he would be reported as missing to the police. Detectives, for their part, at least knew where to start, because his company truck was still sitting in the same exact parking spot it had been the whole time. So they went to the casino, where they found the truck, opened the door, and looked inside. There sat Trevor's wallet, which still contained his credit cards, ID, but no cash. More concerning was there were no signs of Trevor. This was perplexing, but police would begin trying to trace down his movements over the past few days, and they would start back at the 22nd, when he had last called his wife and told her he had not slept in 4 days. Turns out, multiple people saw Trevor gambling at the casino that day. Investigators would discover something else as well. Up until 4 a.m. the following morning, Trevor's debit card was used a total of 9 times, withdrawing all the money from his entire paycheck. Detectives and his family were no doubt concerned now for his safety. Had someone hurt him and stole his debit card and wiped out his money? Well, there were problems with that line of thinking. Like, why was the debit card still found in his wallet? It makes it seem like Trevor took all the money out himself. That looked even more so the case when investigators found a waitress who had served Trevor breakfast at 10 a.m., just 6 hours after his bank account had been cleared out. Here, Trevor ordered oatmeal and then paid for it with pocket change. That wouldn't be the last sighting, though. It would be later that day when another witness would see him walking around in the parking lot, looking disheveled and disoriented. He also clutched his stomach and was asking passerbys for help. After that, the trail went cold for about a year. It would be in December of 2001 the witnesses in Texas would call in and report seeing Trevor. However, these sightings were never confirmed, and it's unsure if he actually got to Texas. In any event, that was 2 decades ago, and he's never been seen again. So what happened? Well, much has been made about Trevor telling his wife he hadn't slept in 4 days, although some sources state that he had actually told another trucker that on the radio. Regardless of which, it has led to much conjecture that Trevor was on meth. In fact, if you remember, he drove 25 hours straight from Calgary to Los Angeles, probably very difficult to do without the aid of some kind of stimulant. Then, there is the witness who had seen him clutching his stomach and asking people for help in the parking lot. It seems like Trevor may have suffered some sort of medical event, maybe of the sleep deprivation, plus possible drinking for the casino, which he was known to do, and the stimulants, triggered some kind of collapse. Or maybe he was hallucinating, leading him to wander off into the desert and die, and his remains were never found. Although it seems odd that he seemed perfectly fine that morning when he ordered the oatmeal, which has led many to suggest he was targeted by someone at the casino or in the parking lot. Maybe when he appeared disoriented, someone realized he was a vulnerable target and took advantage of it. They robbed him, killed him, and then disposed of him somewhere in the desert. However, there should be video footage of the parking lot, considering this was a casino. Not to mention, why would the perp put his debit card back? Finally, some believe that he walked away to start a new life. In fact, police detectives would officially state that. They believed he left by choice, taking all the money from his ATM and walking away, leaving his old life behind. And those sightings in Texas was proof of that. And it could be that he had just felt embarrassed after losing his entire paycheck to the casino. Maybe this was an ongoing problem. Maybe it was going to cause issues with his wife. And if that is the case, then the man walking around clutching his stomach wasn't Trevor at all, and it was just a confused witness. It was 1980 when a 20-year-old Theresa Greaves and a friend would leave their home in New Jersey in hopes of settling down in Utah, more specifically, Salt Lake City. As a teen, she had met some missionaries from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and began attending church meetings. It was there she would befriend Bo Colosi, the friend that was moving with her across country. It was Theresa's wish to move closer to the church in Utah so she could immerse herself in Mormon culture, although that was a secondary reason. The main reason was Theresa was a huge music fan, but you could say she was a super fan of Donny Osmond, maybe obsessed, and it was here that she hoped she could get closer to him and perhaps even befriend him. In fact, she ran the Osmond fan club for a period of years. The two would drive across the country and found an apartment to rent, and Theresa soon began looking for jobs. It's unsure what she did for the first year, but we do know by the following year, she settled into a job as a housekeeper. Her friends would later report that she spent much of her time at a nearby TV studio that the Osmonds were operating, hoping she would see them and could snap off a few pictures. It was after this that Theresa lost her job and would spend the next couple of years applying for different positions and even moved out and in with another woman looking for a roommate. Many of the jobs that Theresa applied for were live-in babysitters, and she interviewed with quite a few people, mainly doctors. But it's on August 5th of 1983 that things got strange. She would call her grandmother back in New Jersey, the woman who had raised her, and told her she was going for an interview in Salt Lake City. As she lived in the area's suburbs, she would board a bus and head towards State Street. This was the last time anyone spoke to her. Theresa's new roommate was not worried at first when Theresa did not arrive back that night, assuming she had went to a friend's or perhaps even a boyfriend. But when she did not return within 2 days, the roommate would contact authorities to report her missing. The problem was, just 2 years prior, when Theresa had lived with the other roommate, she had left the apartment one day with 2 men from South America who didn't even speak English. She had apparently met them at a dance club that was visited often by students from BYU. The old roommate, in that instance, had also reported her missing when she didn't return that night. However, after she filed the police report, Theresa arrived home unhurt. This most likely played a role in the new missing report, since police no doubt thought, well, she will be back just like last time. But she didn't come back, and detectives did follow up on it, and found that Theresa had actually told her roommate that same day she left that she was meeting a couple in Salt Lake City who had a business opportunity for her. Detectives were able to track down one man that Theresa had spoken to that day, a doctor who had interviewed as a potential live-in babysitter. He stated she had called him around noon, and he informed her the job had been given to someone else. He also had no idea where she called from or where she went, and it's unsure if this was the job opportunity that she was allegedly going to speak about, or if she had another interview somewhere else. Investigators would also search Theresa's room, and found the only thing gone was her purse, a pair of heels, and her high school class ring. The case seemed to be going nowhere, so they tried tracking her down via a financial trail, like looking at her bank activity, which revealed She had deposited $98 that morning. After that, everything stopped. Police next went to the post office, where they opened her P.O. box and seen an absolute ton of mail. This had to throw police for a loop. When they began opening them, they seen that it was mostly letters for the Osmond fan club, and all of the letters seemed to reveal an outgoing correspondence with Theresa, although she always responded to the letters using an alias, Risa. Now detectives knew the search net was going to be even wider, and since this was 1983, looking for each one of these people was going to be time-consuming, but that's just what they did, contacting everyone from the Osmond fan club that had ever written Theresa. It took time, and after a lengthy investigation, they could safely rule out every one of these pen pals. After this, the case went cold. It was like she had just stepped off the bus inside the city limits and vanished. Actually, police weren't even sure she made it there, or even made it to the bus. That's how cold the case was, and it would remain that way for years. Her grandmother stayed in touch though, asking for updates over the next decade, but nobody had seen Theresa. Her grandmother eventually passed away in 1997, and police lost contact with the other relatives, but detectives themselves did pick up the cold case in 2012 and looked again, and just like before, they ran into a dead end. There was just nobody that had seen her since she left that morning, and Theresa had apparently not moved somewhere and started over, but they would eventually get an answer, because on February 5th, 2015, 32 years after Theresa walked out and went to a job interview, a man walking his dog would come across a skull setting up against a tree on a hillside next to the highway. He was later identified as Theresa. What had happened? Investigators still don't know, although they've had some ideas over the years. Interestingly, they called on fans of the Osmonds to look through any old fan club mailers and see if there was any correspondence with Theresa and what it revealed. However, that led to nothing. They then turned to a man already in prison for another murder, Douglas Lovell. He was on death row for the murder of Joyce Yost in 1985, which he had done to silence her after he sexually violated her. Her murder occurred just 2 years after Theresa's and just 30 minutes away. However, he would only state he didn't believe he knew anybody named Theresa, and detectives could never find that crucial link that he was responsible. Police then began to suspect an elaborate criminal syndicate could be the guilty party. Apparently, one was being ran out of the Utah State Prison and a halfway house in Salt Lake City. He was ran by a convict named Ronnie Lee Gardner, who worked with a man still unidentified to this day, known only as the Old Man, who would fence stolen property. The third man was a lifelong felon responsible for a ton of burglaries, Daniel Olson Ranquist. He had actually burglarized homes in the area just 2 days after Theresa was reported missing, and one witness even placed him coming out of the brush where Theresa's remains were eventually found, and that occurred right around the time she was reported missing. However, he had been deceased for years, and Ronnie Lee Gardner was executed in 2010, while the Old Man was never identified, although detectives still haven't been able to prove conclusively the two events were linked. But it is possible Theresa's class ring, which was missing from the remains, could have been stolen and sold to a pawn shop, and if it ever pops up, he would be a crucial link to finding out what exactly happened, since police would have a paper trail. And there's also the possibility that so-called job interview was nothing more than a scam, with a person potentially waiting to harm her when she arrived, possibly a sexual predator, or even someone that just wanted to rob her, or it might have been nothing other than an opportunistic stranger who had nothing to do with these theories. Instead, he just happened to see her getting off the bus. It was a warm summer's morning on August 15, 1950, when a man named Nick Mariana would walk out and inspect the baseball field before the day's upcoming game. Nick was the general manager of a minor league team known as the Great Falls Electrics, based in Montana. It was here around 11:30 that him and his secretary, Virginia Ronning, were walking around the empty stadium when something extraordinary would happen. Nick, standing and looking over the baseball diamond, would have a bright flash of light catch his eye from up above. Looking up, he would see two bright silvery objects rotating over the town of Great Falls at a speed he would later estimate to be around 300 miles per hour. These objects were about 50 feet wide and were 150 feet apart. Nick was stunned and knew immediately he needed to get proof of this. Thankfully, these objects became stationary over a smelter stack, so he would run out to his car and retrieve his 16mm movie camera and set it up and began recording the crafts, along with Virginia, who also watched. And since this was 1950, you can just imagine that the cameras, especially ones that were sold for amateur use, were not very good. In fact, he couldn't even record sound, but thankfully, the video was in color. In total, he only got about 16 seconds worth of footage, but it's footage that has went on to be iconic. The crafts then flew off into the distance, no longer observed by Nick or Virginia. This was just 3 years after the Roswell crash, and because of that, UFO interest was at a peak. But even though Roswell had the big documented photo of the so-called recovered crash, and although there had been several other reported UFO crashes, there had until that point never been any video footage. Nick would be the first in history to finally have it. Nick would then leave and go back and review his footage, and was happy to see what he had gotten. He then took it to a local newspaper who ran with the article. In the meantime, local citizens began asking to see it, so he began organizing times for groups from the community to come in and watch. The story by this point was picking up steam, with publications from every town in America beginning to print the story. One of these was a journalist who had actually went to see the film for himself, and after witnessing it, he would call Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and inform them of the sighting. And as you can guess, it didn't take them long to dispatch someone out to investigate. This would be U.S. Air Force Captain John Brynildson. He would go on to interview Nick Mariana as well as Virginia Ronning, who both told the investigator that, right after the UFOs passed, 2 fighter jets did as well. With this, the investigator thought he had a simple answer. What they had really seen were just reflections of these 2 jets that flew by. But he asked to see the film to take it back to Wright-Patterson where they could analyze it better. And this is where our first discrepancy comes up, because Captain John Brynildson would tell a reporter in Great Falls that he was taking back about 8 feet of film with him. Yet, documents would reveal later on that his official message to Wright-Patterson read that he was sending 15 feet of film back to study. This is important, and we'll come back to why in a second. Once the film arrived, it was examined very quickly and determined to be nothing more than the reflections of F-94 jet fighters that were seen in the area at the time. The film was then sent back with a letter which said, "There's nothing unusual about it." But here's where things got interesting. When Mariana got the film back, he noticed that the first 35 frames from the film were missing. These same 35 frames, or 3 seconds of footage, clearly showed the UFOs he had seen, which were spinning metallic discs with a notch on the outer frames. This was now gone. And if you think this is just Mariana's attempt to get famous, well, it wasn't just him. Because remember all those people he showed it to in the community? They stood behind Nick and confirmed that the film they were now seeing had been tampered with and that a few seconds from the beginning had been removed. Of course, the Air Force strongly denied this and instead claimed they had removed 1 frame only, and that was because they had damaged it during analysis. Mariana did not take this well, as you might imagine, and neither did the rest of the country. Because of this, the Air Force would contact Mariana 2 years later and began convincing him to let them analyze the video again. He reluctantly agreed, only after the Air Force signed an agreement that they wouldn't remove any more frames from the film. Their conclusions at the time stated that the objects were not birds, balloons, or meteors, nor were they reflections from jets. They simply did not have an answer. This was followed up on a year later though, after the Air Force and CIA brought in the era's top scientist, who examined the best cases in Project Blue Book. After a careful study, it was ruled once again that these crafts were just reflections of the fighter jets in the area. What makes this intriguing is in the previous year, the Air Force investigation was led by a man named Captain Ruppelt, who would state that the F-94 jets weren't even in the area to cast a reflection. Not only that, but they were too steady to be reflections. This back and forth arguing over the video has went on for decades. It's been studied over and over, with some finding that it was just reflections, while others claiming it might have been birds, and others admitting they had no idea. The biggest study, though, would come from the Condon Report, which brought in a prominent physicist, Roy Craig, and psychologist, David Saunders. Craig would state when he interviewed Virginia Ronning and asked her more questions about that day, she hesitantly said, "What you have to remember in all this is that Nick Mariana is a promoter." And since then, many skeptics have implied that due to this statement and a few other things, that Mariana was just trying to draw attention to his baseball team. It doesn't help that he claimed for years to have been in possession of a letter that he had gotten from the Air Force, where they admitted they deleted some of the film, only for him to go on and claim that he had lost the letter. The comment from Virginia was enough to suit Craig, who chalked the whole thing up to nothing more than aircraft flying by. David Saunders, however, will go on to state he believed the video was more convincing of UFOs than anything that had been discovered up to that point, and many researchers have since agreed with him. The film is so important that it was stored in the National Archives, where it can still be found today. It's been featured in countless documentaries, TV shows, and videos online. It's never been debunked, although many would state you cannot prove a negative, and that's why today most people still believe it was just reflections of nearby aircraft, or maybe even actual aircraft that were flying overhead. But for ufologists, this is one of the biggest proofs of alien visitation. July 22nd, 1629, in a frontier outpost in what is now Albuquerque, New Mexico, a man known as Friar Alonso de Benavides was awaiting the arrival of the man that would take his place as custodian of the Franciscans. He had been superior of the Franciscan missions of New Mexico since 1622, and it was their sole goal to try and convert as many natives as they could to Catholicism. He had served the faith well and was now ending his term, to be replaced by someone else who would continue the cause. That man's name was Friar Pereira, and he showed up to the remote outpost where the two men met and began to converse. Friar Alonso would give Friar Pereira the basic gist of the day-to-day operations, and they would begin the transition of duties. And it's here Friar Pereira would give Alonso a letter that had came from the Archbishop-elect of Mexico, and it was a curious report. According to this letter, a woman named Mary of Jesus of Agreda had made contact with a tribe of indigenous peoples in New Mexico called the Humanos and Tilos. What is odd about this, you might ask? Well, Mary was still living in Spain. See, she was actually the superior at a community of nuns back in Agreda, and since 1620, she had claimed she had been visiting New Spain via an ability called biolocation, something we have discussed on this channel before. Biolocation is the alleged psychic ability, or in this case, miraculous ability, to be in two different places at the same time. According to her, and witnesses that vouch for her, she would go into a trance and would be teleported, or she sometimes said, transported by the aids of the angels to settlements of these two tribes, who were in New Mexico. It's here at these settlements the Blue Nun, or as she would come to be known, the Lady in Blue, would minister to them, all the while never leaving the monastery. Interestingly, she gave very descriptive reports of New Mexico. During her prayers, she would go into her trance and see bronze-skinned men and women in the wilderness of what is now New Mexico and Texas. She would note they used jawbones and teeth of animals to fashion their weapons. Their food was primitive, and for light, they used wooden torches. She knew she had been sent to bring them the Word of God, and she would visit over 500 times in that 9-year period, using this spiritual teleportation. She was even able to speak to them in their own language, and she even healed the sick. As she began to gain converts, she urged them to contact the local Franciscan friars, where our man, Friar Alonso, was at, and asked them to construct new missions for other tribes. Safe to say, she had created quite a stir back in Spain, and if not for her close relationship with the king, she probably would have faced the wrath of the Spanish Inquisition. Now, the Archbishop had sent Alonso this letter, and in it, he wrote that he had not heard of a tribe called the Tilos, which Mary claimed to have visited, but he had heard of Tejas, which were on the far reaches of New Spain in what is now Texas. He assumed Tejas was the Tilos that she had visited, but the Humanos That was an exact match, because there was a tribe known to be traders, farmers, and bison hunters called the Humanos who roamed New Mexico and Texas. Friar Alonso was dumbfounded by all of this news. He couldn't believe the story of Mary's alleged travels. Actually, they had never even heard of Mary of Agrada, but Friar Alonso had his own story that was going to shock Friar Perea, because just recently, a delegation of 50 Indians and their chief had just set up camp nearby the mission, and their name was the Humano. The delegation had came 500 miles from the east, probably somewhere in Texas, and they had told the Spaniards that they had been visited by a woman who dressed in blue. She taught them about her faith, speaking in their own language, and had converted many of them. They told her they wanted to be baptized so they could live as Christians, so she urged them to go find the local missionaries. Even more interesting was Friar Alonso stated that the Humanos had been coming in increasing numbers to request missionaries since 1620, the first year of Mary's teleportation to the southwest. At the time, there wasn't enough friars, but this year, the Humanos had become convinced more than ever that the Franciscans could now fulfill the request. Then, another friar who had worked under Alonso, a man named Juan de Salas, stated that since 1626, the Indians had been telling him about the Lady in Blue, and since he had spoke several Native American languages, he probably didn't misunderstand them. However, he had blown off the stories from the Humanos, thinking they had probably heard about Christianity from other Native American tribes. But when the Spanish showed the natives a small painting of another nun from a convent who wore the same clothes as Mary, the natives stated that it did look like the woman in the portrait, except Mary was young and beautiful, which Mary was, unlike the woman in the painting. They also stated she had came to them from the sky. The Spanish knew they had to investigate further, and they traveled the long distance back to the village, where they met with many thankful Humano villagers who had already built crosses and altars, because the Lady in Blue had told them to. For several days, the friars baptized the Indians, and they taught them prayers and healed the sick. With this evidence, Alonso went back to Spain, where he would inform the king and the pope of the news, and would even meet with Mary herself. And Friar Alonso, after spending many months interviewing her, stated her detailed knowledge of New Mexico was legit. And that brings us to the mystery. What did the Humano tribe really see? Before we get to that, I do have to note that all of the people in this story were very real, even Mary, as she did cause quite a stir in her time. And it was also documented by the missionaries that had met the Humano that no group of Indians that the Spanish would ever meet knew as much about Christianity as the Humano. They were said to have been very knowledgeable about the scripture, so much so that it shocked the Spanish. But having said that, what about theories? Well, the first one is sort of a hybrid theory. The Humano were coming to the Spanish more and more and had been asking for baptism and to be taught Christianity. And meanwhile, Mary really was a mystic who claimed to have had these abilities, but the whole thing was just a coincidence, and neither were connected to the other. A lot of skeptics would even claim that the Humano's real drive in this was protection from the Apache, which once they converted to Christianity, the Spanish would be obligated to protect them. The part about the woman in blue may have came from the Humano traditions, but the friars, who were in need of more converts, just rode with the story of Mary, which influenced the king to keep funding their mission in the Southwest. Of course, this theory doesn't really explain how the Humano knew so much about Christianity, or how Mary had even heard of them. That's why so many believe this was a true miracle, that God had used Mary to reach the Humano and spread the word. But I'll let you tell me in the comment section below. February 1st, 2012, a woman named Gina Vendigna of Honolulu, Hawaii, was out working for a charitable cause. She had been going around the Liliha neighborhood looking for old cans and bottles that she could collect and give to the elderly in the area that were in need of some financial help. The cause was noble, and it often led to Gina not only looking for cans to pick up, but led to her oftentimes digging through trash bins. And it's in pursuit of these recyclables that she came across something she did not expect. She would see a clear Ziploc bag containing what she thought to be ginger root. It had just begun to dry out. Gina thought she was pretty lucky, cause she had been wanting to plant ginger in her garden, so she stuck it in her purse and went on collecting more recyclables. Later that evening as she returned home, she would reach for her purse and pull the ginger out to inspect it more, and what she found horrified her. What she thought was ginger was in fact shriveled human fingers, complete with fingernails. Gina couldn't believe it and was absolutely shocked. She began to shake nervously as she went through the neighborhood and began to talk to friends who all assured her that it was most likely monkey fingers in hopes that Gina would relax. But Gina couldn't relax. She knew better, and she would head to the nearest police station. The veteran officers couldn't believe it either, and they too were a little bit disturbed. In total, there were 6 digits, some whole, some partial, and they still had soft tissue attached. They appeared to have been preserved in some way, since they did not smell bad and were in such good condition. Most likely, they had been kept in ice. Maybe most interestingly, though, was there were no pieces of a thumb. The story would get creepier, however. After forensic testing was carried out on the fingers, it revealed they belonged to a child between the ages of 2 to 5. Unfortunately, they couldn't determine the gender or ethnicity, although some sources would go on to suggest it belonged to a girl between 2 and 4 years old, while others suggested it was a boy 3 to 5 years old. The Honolulu Police Department would begin to cross-reference the remains with their missing child cases throughout the state, but curiously, there were no matches. They then thought, well, maybe this was the fault of a sloppy hospital, so they began calling emergency rooms looking for children that had just been treated for traumatic finger injuries. But that too led to nothing. And if this whole ordeal wasn't creepy enough, it got worse, because obviously detectives went to inspect that garbage bin, and they would be particularly disturbed to see that it sat right next to a children's playground. This really upset the community, which is not a surprise. The police began to look for a suspect, but it was hard to do so when they couldn't even find the child that it had belonged to. They would of course interview Gina, the woman who found them, but she was cleared quick. Crazily enough, there's not much on this one. It's never really been followed up on, and the case never got closure. But we'll take a look at a few of the theories. One of the more interesting ones is that this child had to have the fingers amputated for some medical reason, and the family chose to keep them. I know that sounds strange, but it is a thing some people do. Like, there are instances of people keeping their amputated leg, but it's possible a family decided to hold on to the fingers of their child as a keepsake, and after a while began to feel a little bit unsettled about it and threw them away. The problem with this one is the 2 whole fingers and 4 partial don't really stick out as a medical amputation. Sticking with the medical theories though, it's also possible that it was just a mishandled medical disposure. Maybe it was part of a cadaver specimen, which would explain how they were so well preserved. However, things like this are usually regulated very closely. Finally, I put the darker theories last, which I don't really need to go into. The year was 1888, in the small town of Winslow, Arizona. It was there in an Old West general store that a man would walk in with a packet of goods in his arms. Moving towards the counter, he set down a large bundle that had been wrapped in a worn-out Navajo blanket, and he then proceeded to unwrap it. The clerk had done business with this frontiersman before, and he knew he was there to sell goods. He watched as the man would pull out an animal pelt that was a rich golden tan color with bold black stripes. The entire thing measured just over 7 feet from nose to tail and was beautiful. While the clerk fixated on this interesting find, the traveler would then pull out a jar which he explained was rattlesnake oil, which was accompanied by a couple of rattlesnake skins. The clerk pretty much ignored these, as the tiger-like hide was really catching his eye, and he would ask the man, what animal did this come from? The pioneer reached down to the counter and grabbed a block of tobacco which belonged to the clerk, and cut a piece off and stuck it in his mouth before replying that he had been out in the mountains for a few days doing a little prospecting, looking for a good location to set up a mine. On the 3rd night, he set up camp, had dinner, and laid down for the night, and that's when he would hear a sound which sent fear into him, the purring of a cat, a very large cat. Knowing this was cougar country, he knew he was potential prey. That's when he reached over and pulled his gun close to his side, rolled over onto his stomach, and looked out into the direction that he had heard the noise. He patiently waited, and just a few seconds later, about 20 yards away in the forest, he saw the outline of the creature, which was lit up by the campfire. Knowing it was now or never, he slowly lifted the gun, took aim, and fired. Knowing one shot wouldn't be enough, he quickly reloaded, which might have saved his life, because the wildcat he thought was a mountain lion would let out a blood-curdling scream and make a jump towards the prospector, but it overjumped him, something the man attributed to the light of the fire causing the creature to misjudge the jump. By this point, he must have assumed he had missed on his gunshot as well, and now here was the wildcat just a foot or two away. The terrified man spun around, aimed the gun at the big cat, pulled the trigger, and killed the animal just before it pounced on him, no doubt saving his life. He got up and took a look at it, and soon realized it wasn't a cougar at all. In fact, he didn't know what it was. Although he had been all over these mountains for the past 13 years and learned quite a bit about the wildlife inhabiting it, he had never seen a creature like this before. Regardless, he would have to get his rest if he intended to travel the next day, and that he did, waking up early the next morning and then skinning the cat, knowing there were dealers in the area that often bought Native American crafts along with other curiosities. That is what led him to this shop in Winslow. That account has been taken from the February 23, 1888 edition of a newspaper from Fort Wayne, Indiana, entitled Gazette. The journalist who wrote it allegedly had gotten the story from another correspondent living in Winslow. He would wrap up the account by stating that the clerk bought the snakeskins and sold them to visitors from the east, and then took the jar full of rattlesnake oil and sold it to customers dealing with rheumatism. But of course, the interesting part in all this story is that hide. The clerk would buy this fur that seemed to be a Bengal tiger. He would hold on to it at first, trying to find someone that could identify it. He first took it to a nearby Navajo reservation, where he showed it to some of the oldest members, but none of them had ever seen an animal like this in the area. The clerk then found a book that gave descriptions of nearly every animal in the mountains of Arizona, and again, he found nothing similar. So what was this cat that nearly killed this frontiersman? Is it possible a tiger was actually living in the mountains of Arizona for a short time in the late 19th century? Well, let's start with the obvious theory, so I can go ahead and get it out of the way. That being yellow journalism. The report came at a time when the newspapers were printing just incredibly outlandish tales, especially those concerning the Wild West and cryptids. So it's just possible the writer at the paper in Indiana made the whole thing up, or the so-called correspondent he talked to in Arizona did. Either one is very possible, but considering this tale isn't real fanciful like some of the others at the time, like the ones about dragons, it's quite possible this cryptid story really occurred, but it still most likely has a very plausible explanation. One being, it was what the man originally thought it was, nothing more than a mountain lion, and for whatever reason, the pelt was described inaccurately or greatly exaggerated. Or another thought is this so-called frontiersman was actually a grifter. He instead stitched up a fake pelt and made up an elaborate story, all in the hopes of selling it for a huge price. Or maybe it was a cryptid. October 30th, 2004, Hood River, Oregon. 48-year-old Kimberly Forbes was talking with her daughter right before bedtime about her plans for the following day on Halloween. Kimberly would tell her she was actually having breakfast with a female friend who just lived about 3 miles down the road. After that, she intended to drive to Portland about an hour away to do some shopping, and then return home. It was just before the winter season, and Kimberly wanted to go ahead and stock up on some things for the upcoming weather, and this was the perfect weekend to do it. During this time, her daughter, who some sources cite as a teen, while others cite she was an adult, would not hear from Kimberly. And it's worth pointing out here that due to spotty records, I'm unsure if they lived together or not, but just reading between the lines seems to suggest they did not, which might be why, when her daughter didn't hear from her, she was not alarmed. But it would be the following Monday, when Kimberly did not show up for her job as a bank teller, that her daughter and everyone would know something was terribly wrong. After her daughter was notified that she did not arrive, she promptly reported her missing to the police, who then opened up an investigation to try and track down where she had been over the past weekend. And luckily for them, they knew exactly where to start. Kimberly's female friend that she went to have breakfast with on Saturday. Detectives would soon catch up to this friend and found out that Kimberly never showed up. And she didn't think much of it, figuring that Kimberly just got busy. Now investigators realized how dire the situation was. They had no leads, and it had been 2 days since her last confirmed sighting. To make matters worse, they couldn't find her vehicle either, which soon gave worry to the thought that maybe she ran off the road and into a waterway, and the SUV just hadn't been discovered yet. Well, that was actually not the case, because it would be close to 3 weeks later that her vehicle was actually discovered. But it was not in Portland, where she said she would be going. Instead, it was found in a neighboring city of Gresham, where she would have passed very close to on her way to Portland. More specifically, it was found in the parking lot of a Mexican restaurant, and what investigators found made it much stranger, because the rear passenger window had been broken out and a woman's clothing was found inside and outside the vehicle, along with some food containers and credit card receipts. The detectives didn't really know what to make of it, but obviously they had a bad feeling. This only increased when they opened up the car door and looked down the driver's side, which revealed the driver's seat had been pushed back quite a bit further than Kimberly would have needed. Now her family, along with the police, feared an abduction, although they did wonder how one could have happened, considering this had occurred between her home and the 3-mile drive to her friends. Police would comb the vehicle for clues, trying to uncover any little thing that could help, and they got lucky, because inside the car were fingerprints, which did not belong to Kimberly, nor anyone that would have ridden with her. An even better break would come along because these prints were on record, and police had their man. Easy enough, right? Well, this guy was a local to Gresham, and police were very interested and very confident that they were close to finding out what happened to Kimberly. So they brought him in for investigation, where he claimed he had nothing to do with her disappearance. Instead, he just broke into the car and stole some of the items from within. What these items were, police didn't disclose, but it didn't matter, because the disappearance of Kimberly was more important. But even after they continued to grill him, he stuck to his story that he had nothing to do with her. In fact, he claimed that when he found the car, it had already been broken into. Police would eventually ask him to do a polygraph, and he passed. With that, and the fact that he was fully cooperative, he was ruled out as being involved with her disappearance. And you might be thinking that a passed polygraph means nothing, but it wasn't just that. Police actually had another lead that did confirm his story. Apparently, the car had been sitting at this same restaurant since at least November 5th, as confirmed by the first witness who seen it. So between that day, when it was first spotted, and when the police were notified 2 weeks later on the 19th, several people had walked by the vehicle, and detectives traced down as many of them as they could, and, drawing from their accounts, investigators knew that the car window had been busted out and robbed after it had been parked, which only contaminated the potential crime scene even more. So now police were back at square one. No real leads to speak of, and they didn't really know where to go next. Soon, they would even learn something about Kimberly that breathed new life into the investigation. Being 2004, a time way before apps were abundant on cell phones, people would sometimes look for love online. Kimberly was such a person. As detectives would learn, she had many online relationships in the past, and she had even met one of these previous online boyfriends. Could this hold the key? Detectives wondered, so they would get her computer and began searching the hard drive on it, in hopes of finding anyone online that she had talked to previously and planned to meet. This too, however, led to nothing. They could not find any evidence that she was going to meet someone from online, and in the 2 decades since, no other clues have popped up. Her credit cards have never been used, and her cell phone was turned off and never found. So there's many important unanswered questions. Has she even attempted to get to her friends that morning? There are hardly any places that she couldn't have been abducted on such a short route. Or was she taken from her own property? And more importantly, who and why? Well, it should be of no surprise that once again, the Unsolved Mystery community focuses on their favorite boogeyman, Israel Keys. But this time, they might be right, as there are a few coincidences that could make him fit as a suspect. For one, he was living in Nia Bay, Washington at the time of Kimberly's disappearance, and that's about a 6.5-hour drive. And if you know the story of Israel Keys, you know he would travel huge distances just to pull off the murders, so it wouldn't be surprising. But the big coincidence is, Kimberly's car was left about a mile or two away from Keys' sister's home. However, most dispute this theory and instead suggest the most simple theory that someone known to her was responsible. Maybe they even persuaded her to take them for a ride somewhere, and then the person dumped off the car far away. Although detectives couldn't find any enemies, or anyone that had some kind of obsession with her, it's still the one that makes the most sense. If it wasn't that, then most likely it was just a random carjacking or abduction. Carlos Medina was living the American dream. Arriving in Kodiak, Alaska in 1983 at the age of 26, the young Filipino started working at a local cannery, and within a decade, he was buying a local restaurant, one in which he began introducing Filipino food to the community. It was a smashing success. He would actually grow so much over the following years that he began to talk about expansion. He also left his job at the cannery and started at the Kodiak Electric Company. This allowed him to send money home to his father in the Philippines, as well as helping to immigrate his brother and sister. But it wasn't just that. He was very active in the community as well. He funded a local basketball team, helped elderly people behind on medical bills. He even served as president of a community service organization that did various charity work throughout the area. It may be for those reasons that he was elected to the school board and was about to run for city council. It's with his backstory that would make this next mystery seem impossible, and it's something that has puzzled detectives for decades, because on April 30th, 1993, the now 36-year-old Carlos Medina would begin this rainy Friday like he did just about every day. He would go to his job at the electric company, finish his shift, and go home, eat with his family, and sleep for a few hours, before waking up and going to the restaurant, meeting customers, and begin going over the financial books for the day. Occasionally, he would then go out with friends, before coming back to see the restaurant closed at 2 a.m., along with his younger brother, whom often ran the restaurant for him, a brother that Carlos helped immigrate to the U.S., a man named Rolando. This was the routine for a long time, and one that he stuck to almost religiously, so it was somewhat of a surprise that, on this night, he never arrived to the restaurant after his shift at the electric company ended. However, it wasn't one of those huge clues that something had went wrong, because Carlos was just so involved with other activities as well as business meetings that no one really got alarmed. In fact, he did have meetings that week with other bar owners who had been complaining about his restaurant's late-night karaoke, which was supposed to draw in patrons for food, yet was drawing them in for liquor instead, a violation of his beer and wine license. In any event, he would not arrive to the restaurant that night, nor did he make it home in the late-night hours, which alarmed his family when they woke up the next morning to see he had still not made it home. They in turn would call a member of the city council who, after calling around and finding that no one had seen Carlos, called the police himself. And since he was such a well-known person in the area, a search began almost immediately, one that was carried out all day, until late that night when his truck was found in a gravel pit on a deserted road behind town. This road led to the summit of a nearby mountain, and police blocked the access and left officers to guard the truck over the dark, rainy night until the search could continue the next day. In the meantime, all they could do was hope and wait. Hope that was soon dashed when detectives found blood on Carlos's truck. Not to mention, someone had smeared mud on the dashboard to obscure fingerprints. The next day, a helicopter came into the area while more searches canvassed the ground around the truck. It didn't take long to find his ring and his watch, which was sitting near the road. And a little later in the day, just a mile from his truck, Carlos's body was found. He had been beaten with a blunt object, to the point that his skull had caved in. Unfortunately, the heavy rains had erased much of the physical evidence, but police did discover that his wallet, briefcase, and ID were missing. As you can imagine, the community was shocked, but who would do such a thing, especially to a man that had done so much for the community? That would be just as difficult to figure out as the motive was, because although detectives kept chasing leads and kept claiming they had suspects, nothing ever came from it, and the case went cold surprisingly fast. In fact, Crime Stoppers would only get a grand total of 3 leads within the first year of the investigation. If you don't know how bad that is, consider this. The most complex murder case in Kodiak preceding Carlos's received nearly 130 tips in the first week. So as you can imagine, Either no one knew anything, or they were being kept quiet, which might be why Carlos's wife refused to do any interviews with media or even have her picture taken. And there might be a good reason for that caution. The lead investigator would interview a woman who was thought to know something about the case. After the interview, someone from a payphone called the police station and stated the woman's name and threatened to kill her. Police quickly moved this witness out of town. So obviously, there was a lot to this murder. But what could that be? Well, there were rumors, like maybe Carlos's restaurant success wasn't as grand as he let on. Or maybe he wasn't the guy he seemed. Others really wondered how he had just purchased a home that was near the equivalent of $450,000 in today's money. He was doing well, but not that well. At least, that's what the rumor mill suggested. Detectives did investigate the restaurant to see if maybe they had been working with a local drug racket, or if they were helping to launder money. But if they found any evidence of that, they kept it quiet. Others suggested a robbery gone wrong. But the problem with that was, he rarely carried cash. And isn't it a bit unusual for a robber to beat the victim to death? Investigators also found out that Carlos had been known to pick up hitchhikers. Could that be related? Detectives had no idea, but they did begin to speculate that whatever it was probably connected to a private side of Carlos's life that his family didn't know about. But they couldn't have been prepared for the curve that came next. Remember I mentioned Rolando, who helped run the restaurant for Carlos? The one he helped put through school and helped to immigrate? Well, he would take over the restaurant, and eventually, he ran it into the ground. It failed, and he went back to the Philippines. And soon rumors began to reach back across the ocean and into Canada, where Carlos's other brother, Jerry, lived, and these rumors suggested that Rolando was back home in the Philippines, living it up. He was rich. Jerry would even claim to have had a dream where Carlos showed up and told him he needed to go back home to find the answers. And Jerry did that, as he was obsessed in finding out who killed his brother. And just by chance, or maybe because Rolando heard that he was coming, Rolando got on a jet and went back to Alaska. Jerry wandered throughout his home when he got there, though, and found that he was living like a millionaire. He had installed a marble bathtub into the old family home and had a huge color television, 3 VCRs, 800 CDs, and tons of new clothes. But interestingly, he had Carlos's credit cards, which had been missing since the murder, along with his ID and checks. One he had written himself for $50,000. Not only that, he had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars in life insurance, giving only $100,000 to Carlos's widow and children. It should be noted here that Rolando at one time had been addicted to drugs, and it was only after promising Carlos that he was clean and left that life behind that he would help him get to the US and get his life turned around. And now he paid Carlos back with murder. Jerry would turn his little brother in, and after the detectives flew to interview him in the Philippines, where he acted unconcerned by the whole thing, he would be extradited back to Alaska, where he was charged with Carlos's murder in 1998. The state claimed he killed Carlos in a rage-fueled argument and then stole nearly the equivalent of $600,000 in today's money. So case closed, right? This one's not unsolved. Well, about that, before the trial even started, the charges were dropped. Turns out, way back in 1993, detectives would use this fairly new form of evidence collecting that was called DNA. And, well, they had found DNA of the killer way back then, and they collected it and kept it. Although the technology was very primitive at that time, by 2003, it had advanced quite a bit, and now detectives could prove conclusively that Rolando wasn't the killer, or he wasn't the one that actually did it at least, and most likely, he wasn't even there. The prosecutor stated that the new evidence was so compelling that it would create an ethical problem even pursuing a case against him. He did not state if this meant there was additional evidence to the DNA, but Rolando did plead no contest to 2 accounts of third-degree theft, which gave him 1 year probation. But if Rolando wasn't responsible, then who was? Well, unsurprisingly, he is not totally eliminated as a suspect. Instead, he's just been eliminated from being at the scene and being involved directly. Although he did end up in possession of Carlos's ID and credit card, it's unsure how or when he even got them. I'm guessing the police must have an idea which rules him out, at least directly. It could even be that another relative was responsible and gave Rolando the items, knowing that with his drug addiction past, he may not be able to resist using all the money. and that he would naturally be the top suspect. And it's also possible as well that he was targeted by someone outside the family who only stole the items to make it look like a robbery and then gave them to Rolando later on for the same exact reason. This seems very likely, considering the viciousness of the attack kinda rules out simple robbery. It's even possible he was targeted by some of these other businesses in the area that were complaining about his karaoke night, which was cutting into their alcohol revenue. Or maybe some kind of criminal organization was extorting him. In either case, with the advances in DNA technology, it seems likely this case will be solved sometime in the near future. And that brings us to the conclusion of this installment of Unsolved Mysteries Western Edition. If you liked it and want to support the channel, please check out the Patreon or the members section linked in the description below. For now I say goodbye and good night.